Teachers, when did karmic justice finally come to that one troublesome student? I taught a comparative anatomy animal dissection lab section back in college. I had one kid in a section, let's call him Kevin, who never listened to dissection instructions and just dove in with a scalpel, dicing and chopping and generally mutilating most of the internal organs. His first karmic warning came when we were dissecting squid, and he got squid juice on himself. Smelled awful for the rest of that class. However, he kept on ignoring instructions and hacking away, and this time, karmic justice struck on our very last dissection project, the fetal pig. Kevin really wanted to see the pig's brain. Kevin couldn't get through the skull, so he started whacking away at it with the butt of a flat pry knife. I told him to stop, but he had to give it one last mighty thwack. Crack, the skull breaks, and rubbery piglet brain bits come flying out everywhere, mostly over Kevin, splattering him. Unfortunately, while protesting my refusal to let him dice this piglet into pancetta cubes, Kevin had his mouth open. Thankfully, preserved pig brain, ingested orally, seemed to have a calming, subduing effect on Kevin for the last couple classes. TLDR, don't jerk in dissections unless you're willing to swallow. Had a kid that threw a lock at my head not get expelled because it just slipped out of her hand. She got expelled a few months later for bringing a weapon to school. Last year had a 7-year-old in my class who was just a pain. He's the only child I've ever taught who I've actually disliked. He would throw things around the classroom, pinch other children, stab them with pencils. He was rude to everyone and would always blame it on someone else. Talking to his parents wouldn't help because they believed everything he said, even over adults who had actually witnessed him doing it. They would give excuses and say that other children were blaming him or that he was being picked on. There was nothing wrong with this child other than he had been brought up with no consequences in his life. Anyway, one break time he was harassing another child and I guess they just had enough and this usually mild-mannered child just punched him in the stomach, causing the horrible child to wet himself. And following the indecent up, all of the other children who witnessed it, around 5 or 6, completely closed ranks and denied that it ever happened. I can't usually condone when children hit back, it causes so many other problems, but you better believe all the adults that have had to deal with this child were rooting for the hitter. I interned in a class with this kid who always thought he was smarter than everyone else. He was pretty smart, but not by too much. He always got paired with kids not as smart as him, so he would always be really smug when dealing with them. We learned he got that from his parents. During a parent-teacher conference, his parents praised that boy up and down and thought he was the smartest kid in the school. They built him up as that and they got him thinking that too. Then they went off on my mentor teacher. She wasn't providing him with higher enough education. She was bringing him down. She was terrible. The conference ended when my mentor teacher left the room crying after the verbal lashing. Well, about a week later, there was an event where parents came to watch their children in class. It was to watch them do math games with other students. Well, my mentor teacher paired this smug little bastard with the actual smartest kid in class, the one who was working on more advanced classes after school. The kid got shamed. His parents were so flustered during the event. They were very visibly nervous and upset looking as this kid got destroyed game after game. They left before it was all done and took him out of school for the rest of the day. I coached middle school football. Some kids have come out of their shell by then. Others have not. But at least most of the early bloomers were jerks to make life hell for everybody. The team's starting halfback was one of those jerks. He gave a defensive lineman hell and since everybody thought he was cool they gave him hell right along with him. The D lineman was a big guy but not aggressive or outgoing. Still just in his shell really. He did fine out there because he was a big guy but hardly played to his potential. The little running backs took their Napoleon complexes out on the big guy by running by him and shouting pussy every time he failed to stop them. Rather than fight back to make the play, he would just ignore it and line up and try again the next play. One day the whole thing just clicked for the big guy and he started making plays. He learned to get off his blockers and form tackle and attack the ball carrier. It was a cool thing to see. He loved it. When he really started getting into a groove, I started running the jerk halfback right at the blooming D lineman and watched him plant that guy in the ground with a thud every time. It was just getting easier as I made sure they ran the same play at him play after play. Soon, bruised and beaten, the jerk halfback asked, how many times are you going to run this play? And I responded, once for every time you called him a pussy. Not a teacher, but one time when I was in kindergarten, a kid looked me straight in the eyes, bit himself on the wrist hard, and ran to the teacher and blamed me. That little cunt. They sent me to the principal's office. My mom was called down. I got yelled at and cried. A week later, the kid did it again, and the teacher saw him do it. Felt so good to have the principal apologizing profusely to me, while that little ithead got a mouthful from his parents. I had a student that was a real twerp, always doing things he was not supposed to and purposely causing conflict with other students. He was a daily headache. One day in class he stole a candied pepper from one of Hispanic students and ate it. It was a very hot pepper, not sure of the type. At first I didn't notice cause he is a sneaky kid. He started to sweat and his sweat turned to tears. I need to go to the bathroom, he cried. My mouth. My mouth. I went to investigate and found out what happened. The karma payback plan was now collecting, and I refused to let him go get a drink and continued with the math instruction in hopes of teaching him a lesson. For the next few minutes he pleaded with me to go to the nurse with tears running down his face. I said I do not negotiate with thieves. He started running around in circles. It wasn't until he started sobbing and crying out, I just want my mom, that I finally felt bad and said, if I take you to the nurse, are you ever going to act out in class again? He promised that he wouldn't, and he never did. The tears and sobbing in front of his peers broke his ego and he was a stellar student for the rest of the school year. I teach middle school. I was in pre-K in the early 80s at a private Catholic school. This one kid, Amy, would always bite the other kids. I don't remember exactly how it went down, but I guess one day I came home crying or had a really bad bite mark or something and my mom was pissed. She took me straight to the superintendent, not the principal, and showed her what happened. The superintendent, a really old nun, did not put up with that. She called Amy into her office and bit the duck out of her arm. Amy started crying, but she never bit anyone again. Old nuns in the 80s were hardcore. Note, I am not saying what happened was right, just that it happened. Have another one. We had these two kids, brother-sister combo, with fabulous names. Let's call them Princess and Major. Actually not bad kids, just a little lazy, but the parents were the laziest ducks. Did anything to not work, just sit around and exist. I'm surprised they had the motivation to get off their asses and procreate. Twice. Anyway, there was always some excuse why homework wasn't done, and this was 4th grade, in a city, so homework was it like reading a little booklets to your folks, or practicing multiplication facts. The kids also missed school all the time. The kids were honest. Mommy didn't want to wake up and get us ready for the bus. Daddy was up late with his friends, so we report them to truancy. They turn around and find some lawyer to sue the school for their kids' underachievement. If the teachers were doing their jobs, these precious children would be pre-med students by now. Luckily we kept really good records. The lawyer shows up. The principal, superintendent, truancy officer, our lawyer. Their lawyer starts in. Our principal breaks in, holds up his hand, asks the truancy officer, how many days have these children missed? Ends up they'd missed enough days in the last 3 years to equate more than a year of school. Principal says, now mom, sir, how are we supposed to deliver a quality education to your children if you don't get them to school? Their lawyer quietly packed up her it and left. Freshman English. Busted a kid for plagiarism. He was furious and refused to drop the course. I gave him a second chance, and he continued to plagiarize. He was a slimy, smarmy kid who thought I was just a dumb, clueless TA. But jokes on him, so ended up failing the course 3 ways, plagiarizing, exceeding absences, and failing to turn in a complete final. You can argue about 1 way to get an F. You can't argue about 3. When I was younger, the teacher got tired of the kid who kept disrupting the class and she gave extra homework to everyone in the class except the troublesome kid and made all the students write thanks for the extra homework. Name. Somehow he stopped believing he was cool after that. Had a kid who was a real douchenizzle when I taught 5th. This kid, let's call him Ray, had one of those moms who refused to hold him accountable for anything. It was always, some other kid did it. Ray was just protecting himself. Ray just wanted to fit in. Ray was being targeted. Also, she was one of those kids who would ask Ray if he were guilty and take his no as incontestable truth. She would say, "My son doesn't lie to me." "Oh really? Your kid doesn't lie? Your kid and Jesus? All kids lie." Anyway, I had a full caseload as a special ed teacher, so I got a paraprofessional. Call him Steve. Ray hated Steve. Had some kind of issue with male authority figures. One day Ray gets in trouble coming back from recess. Steve reprimanded him, verbally. By the time Ray makes it to the classroom, he's saying how Steve got in his face and shouted at him. Nope. He asks to go talk to the principal. Yay. Ray's gone for at least 5 minutes. Tells the principal how Steve grabbed his arm when mom comes and gets him. Now he's saying Steve pushed him. Next day we get a phone call. Ray's mom and grandma are coming in and want a meeting with Steve and the principal to discuss how Steve choked Ray. Steve's freaking out. Other kids were there, but no adults. No cameras. How can he prove his innocence? I tell him, go to the meeting and before anybody says anything, have Ray share what happened. Steve came back smiling. As soon as one story came out, everybody else is disagreeing. Well, Ray told me, but Ray told me. I would have loved to see the mom's face as her kid is proven a liar in front of everyone. Not teacher, but I'll tell you a story anyway. There was this guy in middle school that would take it and piss in the hallways. Really weird, but he somehow thought it was funny, so he kept doing it. Well, I was locker buddies with this really early developed guy in middle school. He was like Hagrid big to me back then. I noticed the weird kid standing next to my locker but standing in front of Hagrid's locker. I'm thinking, oh, something's about to go down, so I waited. Hagrid gets to his locker and this kid was still standing in front of his locker. Hagrid tells him to please move out of the way because he was blocking the way. Weird kid says no and starts chuckling. All I'm thinking is oh it. Hagrid asks again and still the same response. This is when Hagrid ducking kicks this MF in the face. Like I've never seen anything like this before. This kid is standing straight up and he lifted his leg higher than I am in height and kicked this kid in the face. Hagrid gets suspended and tells me if that kid ever bothers me to let him know so he can kick him in the face again. I teach college students to be teachers. My first year doing this, I had a student who was always late, turned in the bare minimum at work, always had excuses. I told him he had to improve because if he did this on the job, he'd get fired. He kept coasting and the other profs let him get by. First teaching job, he got fired. I laughed, in the privacy of my office, and I'm not sorry. I was a student, but the karma actually came from the teacher. School trip to Poland. At the hotel you could climb over the balcony on the first floor, onto a plexiglass curved roof you find on bike sheds that ran along that floor. Well, this little asshole who had been in one of the teacher's classes on the trip, alongside me, decided it would be a good idea to run along the plexiglass, then bang on the windows of other rooms. My room was adjacent, so we had ourselves receiving a knock from the balcony at like 10 PM, but figure it was a one-off. Anyway, a minute later, we hear what I can only describe as pure rage coming from next door. The teacher was next door to us, and must have had the blinds up or walked onto the balcony cause he saw this little id try to sneak by and dragged him back inside. Anyway, a few minutes go by and this teacher is still screaming at him in the corridor. You could hear the guy bawling his eyes out. We were like 16 BTW, but even listening to it was horrifying. Imagine the drill sergeant scene from FMJ amplified. It was traumatizing. The guy was banned from any more school trips, which was great because he was meant to go skiing with school later that year and lost his deposit. I'm sure the teacher loved every moment of it. TL. Dr. Kid tries to harass other people in a hotel. Accidentally gets caught by teacher. Drill sergeant scene from FMJ ensues. Edit. Guess what? I actually found the hotel it happened at on Google, and I'm pretty shocked now the guy managed to not slip. Had a student who would routinely get his cell phone out and wouldn't put it away when asked. Often left the room during class. Karmic justice. Failed the course. I'm an elementary school teacher. so this doesn't seem quite as serious as the others. Here goes though. There was a problem child in my class who thought it was cool to not listen to teacher advice, shrug off reprimands, and make snarky comments. He was hard to manage, but by no means a bad kid. We have a rule at our school that there's no running on the deck outside of our classroom. The official reason for this is that it's dangerous, but the rule is often ignored when no teacher is looking. One day the entire class and myself were standing out on the deck, lined up for lunch, when this particular student was coming back from getting something in the front building. He decided to blatantly ignore the no running on the deck rule that he had been reminded of probably 100 times before, and he began to sprint towards the class. Right as I yelled his name, he tripped and went flying. It was an epic wipeout that sent him sprawling across the deck, which the entire class saw. I checked if he was okay, and didn't say anything about it at the time, but I was able to remind him later that we do have rules for a reason. I did feel rather like justice had been served in that once delicious moment. However, TLDR, snarky kid had epic wipeout because he ignored the rule. Justice. Edit. To clarify, the deck is like an uncovered porch, made of wood with a barrier around the edge that leads to the front building in this case. I didn't realize that people don't call them decks everywhere. I teach kindergarten, and I had a terrible child in my class last year. He liked to pull his desk away from the girl sitting across from him so her pencils and crayons would go falling on the floor. Finally, one day she got fed up and slammed her desk back into his. Unfortunately for him, his fingers happened to be there. I had to resist the urge to be like that's what you get, but instead I just reminded him that that's why I said not to move his desk away from the rest of the table and sent him to the nurse.